Hey everyone, welcome back to JP's Budget Collecting and our weekly look back at the hot comics from 6 months ago. This week we're looking back at the hot comics from March 8th, 2024. Recording this a little earlier in the week. We're recording this on September 4th, 2024. As always, I give you guys those dates so you know when this information is actually most relevant, because the market is always moving and changing, as we'll see as we go through the list. As always, we're looking back at the CBSI Hot Top 10 and the Comic Tom Key Collector Hottest Trending Comics of the Week from that week. And as always, we're just doing this to try to understand what made these books hot, why were people chasing them, and what factors have affected them since that would have made it smart to be patient on these books, or should you have bought them in the moment? And as for the most part, it's be patient, but you know, there are exceptions. So let's dig into this list. We got 18 books to get through. So let's get started. First up, we got a repeat from last week. We got Resident Alien number 0, hitting the list for the second week in a row. Last week when we talked about it, it was like a $15 to $25 book. By this point, it was up to like $50 for high raw sales. And this was all about this show coming to Netflix. It had been coming out for a while, I think on Sci-Fi or something. It's moving to Netflix. That's what caused it to hit the list. Now it's a $5 to $30 book, but most of the sales are like $5 to $15, with just a couple of sales in that $20 to $30 range. I think 2 sales above $15 here. Everything else was below $15. So we're going to call this a dumpster fire, because it really is like a $10, $15 book at the moment, after being a $50 book back then. Next, we have Jinx number 1. This was also on the list last week, and was the result of Brian Michael Bendis signing a deal with Amazon to develop all of his comics into something. No series were actually announced as part of this deal, specifically, but Jinx was one people was chasing. Last week it was like 10 to 15. By this point it was going for 30 to 40. And just like we talked about last week, there's been no recent sales here, even though the book is, there are listings for less than, in that $15, $20 range. There's no sales. So we're going to call this down a trap, because if it would sell at these prices, it would be a trap. You could almost call this a dumpster fire. All right, with that, we got one more kind of option TV stuff related. We have non-Marvel DC movie news, and that is Dune number 1. And this was right when Dune 2 was coming out back in the spring. So the original comic book was hitting the list. Raw copies were going for $25, 9.8 hit 180. Now raw copies are $5 to $10. A lot of sales on this, and it's a $5 to $10 book. The most recent 9.8 sale went for $100, but there was just one just a few weeks ago that went for $225, which seemed a little high. But overall, we're still going to call this down a trap, because the vast majority of sales are raw copies, and it is a trap on that side. All right, next we have Grunts Comics presents number 1. This hit the list. It was basically, we're coming up on the 30th anniversary of his passing, and so this comic with him on the cover was hitting the list. Back then, it was basically like a 30 to 80, but they said then there was a sale jumped all the way up to 100. So we got $30 to $100 on this back then. Now it's a $10 to $15 book. That is definitely a dumpster fire. There was a bunch of sales in the lead up, but none of that sustained. All right, with that, we're going to move into our covers. We got 3 that are just cover, and then we got some cover / buzz going on after that. So first up, we got Spawn number 350. This is the 1 per store Todd McFarlane signed variant. So basically, you could get 1 per store with him signing it. Back then, out of the gate, these McFarlane signed variants have always done huge numbers when they first came out. Back then, this was a $350 to $600 book for raw copies. Now it's a $275 to $400 book for raw copies. No recent sales on the 9.8 here that I could find, so we're going to call this a down, and I'll be back. A little bit, you could almost call trap, because they said most of the sales were like around 5 to 6 back then, but there was enough sales close to 400 in the 350 range that it was in that lower range of it was before. So we're going to call it, and I'll be back. Next, we have another book that was on the list last week. We have Power Girl number 6, the Dan Panosian 1 in 25. In its first week, it was a $40 to $45 week. In week 2, it jumped up to an $80 book for this 1 in 25, which is get to that triple ratio number. But normally, we talk about week 2 peaks don't hold. Well, this one was now, it's still a $70 to $120 book. So yeah, it did hold that week 2 peak. Although the only reason 9.8 sale went for 105, which is less than several of the raw sales. So we're going to call it steady and worth it. You could argue maybe up, but it's there's definitely sales around $80 still. So we're going to call it steady and worth it. Next, we have our other cover that was a repeat from last week. We have Harley Quinn, number 37, the Sebastian Fulmer 1 in 50. It was a $160, $200 book last week when we talked about it, and then it was a $310 book for high sales by this point. Now the only recent raw sale went for $150. 9.8s are going for $300 to $400. So yeah, on the raw side, this is down. If you pay $300 for the raw out the gate, that's a trap. So yeah, this is a case where the second week peak definitely went over what the market would sustain. All right, next we got Wolverine, number 36, hitting the list because we got first appearance of Wolverine, and this was when we got solicitations, or right around the time we got the solicitations that Wolverine was getting his own series. And this was like the third or fourth week in a row this had actually been on one of the two lists. And it started out at like 2025 and then 200, and then it was 45, 65, and then 200. And it was 65, 75 by the third week, and still around 200 for 9.8. At this point, it was going 50 to 75 for raw copies. 9.8 still 175, 200. So those have been pretty steady throughout that whole process. Now it's a $50 to $100 book. 9.8s are still 150 to 200. So steady and worth it. There's a lot of love for this character so far. I'm a little surprised it's lasted as long as it will. We'll see how long Wolverine sticks around, or if people start to forget about it eventually. All right, next we have giant size SpiderGwen, number 1, the Betsy Cola 1 in 25, and this is the first appearance of Doc Ock's adopted son, which I didn't even look up his name. It's a Doc Ock's adopted son. So anyway, there's a character first appearance here, plus it was a 1 in 25. And it was still only doing 30 to 45 back then, which I figured, well, I didn't do if you've noticed, there's been no predictions for me because I didn't get a show out that week, a cash or trash out that week. But now it's still a $30 to $50 book, although I should say it's a $30 and $50 book because there's only 2 sales. So we'll call this steady and worth it. The 2 sales are right in the range where it was before, but again, only 2 sales on this one. Next, we have Ultimate Spider-Man number 1, the Marco Cinchetto 1 in 25 of the third print, which is just really a virgin version of the first print cover of the main A cover. Back then, this third print 1 in 25 was going for 50 to 80 because everybody was going crazy for this series. Now raw copies are 20 to 40. There was one sale that was clearly a bit of an outlier that went for 70, but there was a bunch of sales in the $20 to $40 range. 9.8, 65 to 125. So we're going to call this down in a trap, despite that $70 sales, because it's clearly backed up significantly here. Next, we have Ultimate XMen number 1. And this was basically another new Ultimate series. There was some buzz around this Peach Momoko X-Men book. I think a lot of people have liked this book. But by this point, there were more books being ordered up front. So there's a higher print run here than there was on some of the other ones. So it didn't jump as high. It was only a $10 to $20 book out the gate. Now it's a $5 to $10 book. 9.8 going for 50. So yeah, down in a trap on this one as well, because it actually got ordered and printed at around the number of people that really wanted it. So next we have Spider-Man number 1 from 2012. This is the first meeting and team up of Miles and Peter, and this was hitting the list because we had got the announcement that we were getting it had just come out. We'd just gotten the first issue of the new Spider-Man series that's been going on, and yeah, so that series has been very popular. Compared to most of the other Spider books. Raw copies were going for 30 back then. 9.8 was going around 100. Now it's a $5 to $15 book. 9.8, 75. I remember when this book jumped way up when people were specking on this thing. But yeah, it's now basically just a very low key and down in a trap from what it was 6 months ago when the new series started in the comics. Next, we have a couple of Ashan books we're going to talk about. First up is Feral, number 1. This is the Ashan. This is from the Stray Dogs authors. Appears to be a cat version. I'm sure it's a different story, but like similar to the Stray Dogs thing in terms of aesthetic, just with cats. $40 to $70 out the gate on this one. And this is another one that only has 2 recent sales. A $60 and a $99 sale. So it's hard to really judge. Was this up? Was it straight cash? I mean, obviously, the $60 sale was at the higher end of what it was before. The $99 sale was above, but again, only 2 sales. I put it as up. I could be talked out of that pretty easily. Next, we had Space Ghost number 1, the Ashan for the new upcoming series, and this was actually printed as like an old school Ashan, smaller comic, smaller size comic, and everything. $10 to $15 out the gate, and now it's a $5 book. So another trap here, although a small one because it was only $10 to $15. But yeah, nobody's paying that now. All right, with that, we're gonna move away from Comic Buzz, and we got a DC movie related book, maybe a weird Marvel thing, and then a couple of Deadpool books. First up, we got All-Star Superman number 1. Hidden the list because James Gunn keeps talking about it and was giving out copies to people that were in the movie to read, including the guy playing Lex Luthor in the new Superman movie, and I can see his face and I can't think of his name at the moment, but anyway, like he talked about it on some podcast he was on, that James Gunn had given him this to read. Back then, raw copies were $8, 9.8, 125. Now it's still like a $2 to $12 book for raw copies. 9.8 is 90 to like 150. So this has been pretty steady throughout all of this, despite like it keeps hitting the list because there'll be a bump in sales, but it really hasn't jumped much in value. It's kind of just sat where it's at. Next, we have New Mutants, number 100, and you're like, New Mutants 100? It is the first appearance of X-Force, and this hit the list because the Kick-Ass director was in an interview, and he said, yeah, he'd been hired to do an X-Force movie way, way back in the day that never happened, and this was before any of the Deadpool movies, and yeah, that it would have been, he still would like to do it or something anyway. So that's what he was talking about this, and that's why this hit the list. Raw copies were going for $4, 9.8 going for 100 because some guy talked about it, I guess. But really, those are about the prices this book goes for. It's basically a $4 or $5 book. 9.8, 75 to 100. So we're gonna still call it steady, and I'll be back because that's just what this book goes for. It was just a bunch of sales because that guy talked about it. Next, we have New XMen, 114, the first appearance of Cassandra Nova, and this was kind of following, we'd gotten confirmation at that point that she was going to be the villain, or a villain for sure, in the Deadpool movie. Back then it was like an $18 book for raw copies, 9.8 going for 160, and now it's a $10 to $15 book, 9.8, 100 to 160, so still a bit of a down, and I'll be back. Even though we're less than a month out from the movie's been a huge success. I think most people enjoyed her as a villain. And yeah, this book still didn't ever really gain a ton of value and didn't really hold it. So next, we have All New Wolverine, number 1. First Laura Kinney as Wolverine, and this same thing with the Deadpool stuff. Rumors were really starting to ramp up that Daphne Keane was going to be in the movie, and so, yeah, people were specking on anything X-23 Laura Kinney related. Raw copies back then were 30, and 9.8 going for 110. And again, wasn't that much higher than what the book generally goes for. Now it's a $15 to $20 book for raw copy, 9.8, 1 to 120. So, down and I'll be back on the raw side. Not a lot of 9.8 sales, but they've been pretty steady, which is about where this book usually sits. So, that's our list for this week. I want to thank you guys for watching, and we will catch you next time. Later.